Britain's most prolific child killer, Lucy Letby, a nurse trusted with the lives of newborn babies, today found guilty of 7 murders and the attempted murder of 6 more innocent children.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In total, Lucy Letby spent 14 days in the witness box and faced nearly 60 hours of questioning. But did I feel any clearer about her true self? No. She returned to the glass wall dock for the rest of the trial. June turned to July. The lawyers closed their cases and the judge summed up the evidence. I'm reading from an article titled, What I Learned About Lucy Letby After 10 Months in Court. It's written by the BBC's Judith Moritz, and I'll put a link to it in the description. She goes on to write, Now the nurse's future was in the jury's hands. They had 9 months of evidence and 22 charges to work through. Was Letby evil personified or a victim herself? How they felt about her would determine the rest of her life. Finally, the answer. The smiling nurse with the sing-song name who went to salsa classes is now Britain's most prolific child murderer. Can anyone make sense of that? I know I can't. After 10 months in a courtroom, listening, observing, female reporters came out of the trial seemingly none the wiser. Guilty, yes, but why? They couldn't seem to answer the question. I've experienced the same thing in 2 high-profile South African trials. Henry van Breda, the triple axe murderer from Stellenbosch, convicted, and Oscar Pistorius. Both suspects took the stand and testified and were cross-examined at length, like Lucy was. The evidence led over weeks and months eventually leads to a conviction, but afterwards the media and even the prosecutors seem to have no idea why these crimes happened. People saying, we don't know why, almost seem to hold it up as a badge of honor. It's not a badge of honor. It's a badge of ignorance. It's an inability to understand criminal psychology. It's important to remember that inside the criminal mind, things do make sense. There are reasons behind why a criminal does what they do. And if we can't make sense of something, it's because we're still on the outside looking in. I want to say that motive is the most difficult aspect in the true crime genre, and one reason is because we're not good at subtlety. As a society, as a culture, we are good at surfaces. We're good at labels. We're good at simple answers to complicated questions. We're good at being told what to think by experts, by pundits and blowhards. But we're not terribly good at thinking for ourselves in a systematic, cohesive, integrated and coherent way. This is because our thought processes aren't processes but fragments, and we think it's okay to think in a fragmented way. The key to understanding motive is in seeing a thought process that evolves over time. That requires a scout mindset, being curious, as well as critical thinking. Our highly opinionated rush-to-judgment society trains us to be the opposite of those things, not curious or open-minded about information, nor patient about finding answers. Instead, we want assertive, simple, instant results that feel subjectively true and feel reinforcing rather than objective and requiring us to think. Thinking is difficult and thinking is painful when you're used to having others do it for you. On this channel, I like to encourage people to think for themselves. So let's do that. Let's ask a very difficult question and let's deal with the complicated answer in a systematic way. And the question is, where does her sadism come from? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the thousands of you who have subscribed. I do want to encourage you guys, if you don't know about the Long Island serial killer case, Rex Heuermann, we're in a unique position where we can look at two serial killers, one convicted, the other suspected, and kind of get a sense of what is going on in the mind of a serial killer. I mean, this is as intertextual as it gets in the true crime sense. Another question to ask is, how is a female serial killer different to a male serial killer? How are they the same and how are they different? If you're finding this episode useful, meaningful, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So there has been some useful commentary about motive, about why Lucy did what she did. There's an article in the Daily Mail dealing with motive, specifically where criminologist David Wilson said that Lucy's desire to be at the center of a crisis was indicative of the mental disorder of Munchausen syndrome. She's creating a crisis around her, which is a form of Munchausen's. The question really is why? Even if that's true, why and where does that come from? Now, although this is at least taking a step towards attempting an explanation, it's really just another label. It doesn't really connect to who Lucy is. It's still an outside-in approach. Back to the article, extraordinary stories are being told about what happens when she's on shift. She's saying, look at all the things that occur when I'm around. Mr. Hughes said it was unclear exactly why Letby had targeted certain children, other than having the opportunity. Perhaps because she was alone with them as their allocated nurse, or their parents had temporarily nipped away to get some sleep or food. But once she had chosen a victim, there'd been a determination to harm and kill, he said. The same children were repeatedly attacked. Some died, others were saved only when they were moved to a different hospital. Now you may notice all of this is really reviewing what she did. It's not really burrowing into the why of it. Anyway, back to the article. Once she's decided to attack a victim, she's gone back to the same victim, he said. So when she's chosen, she's got a determination to really try to kill them until she either does or circumstances change that stop her. She controls, and those words really need to be emphasized. She controls. Once she's decided to do it, if the outcome is not what she's wanted, she's gone again and again and again to try to do it, which brings us back to her being controlling and manipulating. And again, those words really need to be emphasized. It brings us back to her being controlling and manipulating. And you can see they haven't found the answer. They've more kind of asked a question. She controls. She's controlling and manipulating. Why? Where does that come from? So the operative question is to ask, why is there this unusual, this extreme need to control? Manipulation is a form of control where the manipulator tries to hide or disguise their efforts at control. But where does this need to control come from in the first place? As we're about to see, it comes from low self-esteem and a self-perception that one is weak or lacks agency relative to others in the normal course of doing things. According to the article, the officer agreed that she was a monster who not only killed her vulnerable victims, but also made them suffer. Mr. Hughes said that monster fits because I can think of nothing worse. And now we're back to a label. Calling Lucy Letby a monster or evil is no better than what small children call scary creatures. It's an incredibly unsophisticated term to still be using after a 10-month trial, which is why we are where we are. And where are we? DCI Nicola Evans, the Deputy Senior Investigating Officer in the case, said that being unable to tell the parents of Letby's victims exactly why she had attacked their babies was really hard and difficult. Well, exactly. And isn't that why one must put in an effort to try to explain what happened here? DCI Evans said, I couldn't put my finger on what her motive was, and ultimately only Lucy Letby can answer that. She's had the opportunity during the trial and her interviews and has continually denied the offences.
Are you out of your fucking mind?
Is Lucy supposed to tell us why she did what she did? Manipulative Lucy. Lucy's trying to avoid the pain and social death of imprisonment, so why would she volunteer something that would further incriminate her? How can we be at this point where investigators feel the only way to know something about a criminal is if they tell us? The Detective Chief Inspector also goes on to say, it's my view that she will continue to deny them, so we might never get that answer.
Are you out of your fucking mind?
Ironically, that is where the solution lies, where the likely solution needed here is that we get out of the inside of our own minds, and in order to get into someone else's mind, you've got to get out of the inside of your own mind. You've got to step out of your shoes and into their shoes, right? You need to walk the path of the person you can't understand if you really wish to understand them. And so, are you prepared to do that? Well, if for no one else, law enforcement, investigators, detectives, prosecutors probably need to think about this to some extent, because the article ends off saying, our objective was to tell the families what happened, and one of the things we haven't been able to do is tell them why. As a police officer, that's really difficult. And so you might say, after one murder, it's not the end of the world if you can't explain something. But when you've got 7 plus 6 attempted murders, and you still can't explain what is going on, when you have the same thing repeated over and over, you really do have to kind of look in the mirror and saying, jeepers, what's going on? As I've said before, reading someone else's mind isn't hard.
It wasn't hard. All it takes is a little push.
One can start by reading what they're reading, but one of the easiest ways to get to know the interiority of someone else, besides by talking to their parents, is by talking to a best friend. And the BBC did that. Quote, Dawn didn't feature in the trial, but she and Letby go way back. They grew up together and are still in touch. Dawn was immediately warm and likable. We went for a drive and she pointed out the Cathedral Green where she and Letby used to hang out and their favorite restaurants. That's where we used to spend lunchtimes away from all the popular kids, Dawn told me as we drove past the geography block of their old school. You weren't popular? I asked. She laughed. No, we were the nerdy ones that concentrated on our studies and didn't mess around in the lessons. But Dawn, aren't you leaving the most important part out? Didn't they have any romantic relationships? Strange. We seem to have heard the same thing before about Rex Heuermann. The writer doesn't mention it here, but another similarity between Lucy and Rex Heuermann was that she had doting parents, specifically a doting mother figure, but in Lucy's case, it's a father as well. But another word for doting is domineering. I think a very domineering figure in one's life can feel suffocating. But let's use the more opposite word, controlling. That word's come up a few times now. Okay, so that's where the need to control things comes from. It's learned behavior. If you want a certain outcome, you can get it through control, coercion, or manipulation. You might think that's an exotic attitude. You may even think it's reaching to make that assessment. That what we're talking about here is a fairly alien way of going about things, the sort of monstrous psychology only psychopathic serial killers are capable of. But at a casual glance, it's easy to see YouTube's true crime channels are infested with manipulative opportunists. Maybe you know one or two. Now, returning to the BBC article, quote, the friends had moved on to sixth form college together, and while most of their circle had no firm career plans, Dawn told me that Letby was clear about her path. It was always her aspiration, her dream, to become a nurse and to help babies. She told me she'd had quite a difficult birth herself and was quite poorly, and I think that's affected a lot of her life.
These are your words.
She feels that's what she was called to do, to help children who might have been born in similar circumstances. And that sense of fate is echoed in this text sent slap bang in the middle of Letby's baby slaughter, June 22nd, 2015. She writes, I think there's an element of fate involved. There's a reason for everything. Back to the BBC article, unwavering in her loyalty and belief that her friend was incapable of murder, was it possible that Letby had pulled the wool over her eyes? And yet the journalist writing about wool over eyes asks rhetorically whether anyone else can make sense of this crime. Mind if I give it a go? When Lucy Letby was born on January 4th, 1990, it was a very difficult birth. The narrative around her birth shaped her parents' possessive, protective, and controlling attitude. They nearly lost their only child, knew how awful that felt, and didn't want to ever risk losing her again. As an only child, that narrative also shaped and affected her life. She heard it constantly, and it made her feel special.
You're special. Part of a new beginning. You're special.
You've been chosen.
Very special.
Chosen to survive. You've been chosen.
You have a very
Chosen to
special
survive.
purpose.
Carry on.
Part of a new beginning. You're special.
Lucy was very grateful for being alive to the nurses who would have helped save her life. But she likely also felt a kind of terror that in her earliest moments of life, when she was naked and new, and life was raw and red, her fate was in someone else's hands. And as warm and cozy as the cocoon at home was, life outside of it was cruel and cold. While others had friends and boyfriends, real life seemed to be passing her by. As a result of feeling alienated while at school, she gravitates towards that seminal moment where she is saved, loved by strangers. She also gravitates to a kind of hackneyed, Disney-inspired view of the world as a safe, soft place filled with kindness and innocence. It's in the contrast, the mismatch, the complete disconnect, not only of the handwriting but the overall tone of her chaotic notes compared to her neat-as-a-pin diary, that we get a glimpse of Lucy's lost innocence. The reality isn't that Lucy is innocent, but terribly naive.
You're unbearably naive.
And no one is more painfully or pitifully aware of this vulnerability than Lucy herself. It's an awareness that fills her with terror, existential dread, and a sense of helplessness. That's the opposite of feeling in control. And that feeling of control is a default setting that's been instilled in her by her overbearing parents. So, things that many of us would regard as unremarkable could rock Lucy's world at its foundations, triggering existential fear. Simple things like moving house and not having a boyfriend. According to an article that came out in the Daily Mail just 2 days ago, quoting the prosecutor when Lucy was on the stand, "You had a house, you had a car, you had a boyfriend?" "Yes," Lucy replied. The trial heard no further evidence about this apparent relationship. It is not clear how long it lasted or even who the boyfriend was. Alternatively, he may have been a figment of Lucy's imagination. The nurse is not known to have shared any romantic relationships, with one mother of a close friend saying there were no boyfriends. Well, not that I knew of anyway. Now do you see how a relationship with a married doctor, if it were a first, could be extremely traumatic if it were the first for a terribly naive and innocent cloistered nurse? Because of her limited view of the world, what she knows is the circumstances of her birth led to the world creating a fuss around her, and so, once firmly ensconced in that very same dynamic, one she has been reaching for her whole life, she cannot resist the temptation to take control of her world in a similar way, to get attention, to exert power, to gain a sense of symbolic control, and also to pull the strings of one particular doctor she's attracted to.
That wasn't such a long walk after all, was it?
So, are we ready to answer the question objectively? Where does her sadism come from? Well, it comes from her parents, but then, and this is the second part to that, then she makes it worse. So the source of it is her upbringing, the childhood situation, right? which is relatively benign, but then she makes it worse. How does she make it worse? Someone who has a very limited knowledge of the world and of love chooses to work in a very anal environment at night with babies that she can't form real relationships with. And that's what she really needs to learn what to do and how to do it. She learns to respond to environment in a very narrow, negative, self-limiting way. Default settings of control that she's known her whole life since she was a child. And there's a sense of catharsis and transcendence in governing over the infant-parent dynamic. Whenever she initiates an incident, she becomes the center of the universe, a feeling like a power trip that for someone as socially powerless as she is, soon becomes an addiction. And how about Rex Heuermann? Where does his sadism come from? Same place. His parents. But then he makes it worse by working in a very anal environment. I've scratched the surface of that work environment in my previous video dealing with Rex Heuermann. So I'm not going to take it further than that since we've just broached the subject of sadism. The next step is to understand the mechanics of sadism in the criminal mind. And I've got to tell you, I don't like making YouTube videos like this because people are not reading, they're not concentrating in the way that they would if they were reading a book. And so it's easy to have these ideas and analysis just go in the one ear and then you go, oh, I don't think that that's true, because you're not really thinking about it, you're not really focusing on it. And so if this analysis doesn't resonate with you, you might want to try listening to it again and just spending a little bit of time with it. And because I've written many books dealing with the same thing, I have spent time with it. This wasn't a here today, gone tomorrow thing that I came up with 5 minutes ago. So you might want to spend a little bit of time with it, stew on it, and see whether it does germinate in your mind, in an authentic way. In any event, this brings us to the number 3 clue we all missed. And we'll be dealing with that in the next episode. Any idea what it is? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.